Lecture of the season. My name is Ken. I'm the Education Coordinator at Guelph Museums. And I'd also like to thank the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada for their partnership and help in doing this series. Thank you. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that this place we call Guelph has served as traditional lands and a place of refuge for many peoples over time, but more specifically the Adirondack and the Haudenosaunee. This land is held as the treaty lands and territory with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Guelph lies directly adjacent to the Haldimand Tract and is part of a long-established traditional hunting ground for the Six Nations of the Grand River. Many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who have come from across Turtle Island call Guelph home today. Guelph Museums continues to build our knowledge and relationships about the land, its history, and its peoples, and this commitment informs all that we do at Guelph Museums. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Kelly Morrison, who just got back from Scotland.
Yes, I did.
So hopefully you didn't cut your trip short just to come speak to us.
No. I squeezed it in.
So Kelly's a PhD candidate in history, specializing in war and society at Wilfrid Laurier. She earned her honors BA and MA in history at the University of Toronto. She's published several articles and has guest lectured on the subject of war, commemoration, and propaganda at the University of Toronto and Wilfrid Laurier. She has been a guest speaker on the Home Child History at Brant Museum and the Archives British Consulate in Toronto. She's a regular keynote speaker at Remembrance Day luncheons hosted by the Royal Canadian Navy. And we're really happy to have you come out tonight. So thank you. I'm looking forward to the talk.
Good evening. Thank you very much. A really warm welcome. Yes, I was in Scotland last week, and about 4 days ago, I had no voice at all because I was never dry and I was never warm in Scotland. So I had a test run with my voice yesterday, and it was a bit dicey, so I have not said a word all day. So let's hope. Fingers crossed. I have lozenges, everything. So yes, I just want to say good evening and thank you for coming, and to Ken and the Guelph Museum community for inviting me to speak about British home children in Canada. So in my talk here this evening, I'd first like to share with you how I first encountered British home child history. I'll then sort of go into an overview just for those of you, I know we have members of the home child community here tonight, but just for those of you who are not overly familiar with home child history, I'll do a little overview. And then just talk a little bit about how I hope to contribute to the topic with my research, sharing some of the archival research that I completed. I actually wasn't just in Scotland. I've been away for about 8 weeks in archives across the UK. And so just at the beginning of my research for my dissertation. So just starting out. When I was at the University of Toronto and working on my master's thesis, it was a local history of how one town, Almonte and Lanark County, experienced the Great War. And in their archives and local publications was recognition for the importance of home children to the development of their community and also to their war response. And home child names are amongst those listed on the town memorial, both First and Second World War and Korea. When I began my initial work on British home children, I was struck by one sort of defining and overarching feature, and that is that there are so many stories. For those of you personally connected to a home child or their cause, perhaps you know firsthand what it is to be compelled by the need to tell, to recount, and to advocate on such a fundamental and personal level. But there's another imperative, and that is to recognize the collective impact that British home children had on so many aspects of Canadian history. So that, in particular, is what inspires me and drives my research, and hopefully, ultimately, I'll be able to add two conversations about it. So just a general overview of home child history. So the convention of shipping destitute British children to the far reaches of the empire can be traced to at least the 17th century, with the need for labor in the early Virginia colonies. We know that about 100 so-called vagrant children were organized by London parishes and sent to America in 1618 by the Virginia Company. By 1623, several hundred children had been forced to migrate to serve in the settlement. The practice began in earnest, however, in the mid-19th century. The so-called child migrant, or often referred to as the home child program, as it came to be known, was first conceived of as early as the 1830s. It was motivated in part by rampant adult mortality and high rates of inner-city poverty across Britain. The Industrial Revolution, spanning the late 18th to the early 20th centuries in Britain, produced a growing industrial economy and drove mass migration into its urban centers. Between 1801 and 1851, the British population doubled from 9 million to 18 million. And large numbers settled in cities such as London, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, Dublin. The 1834 repeal of the Old Poor Laws in that country sought to reduce state welfare spending and also reinforced this idea that poverty reflected somehow an individual moral failure. Behind the child migrant scheme were powerful churches, evangelists, and wealthy philanthropists who believed that children, and particularly the most vulnerable children, should be rescued and given new opportunities. By the 1860s, almost 500,000 British children relied on some form of poor relief. From this context emerged a plan that would eventually send more than 150,000 children to Canada and to the British Dominions, including Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and even the Caribbean. Of the 150,000 children sent overseas, more than 100,000 came to Canada. Between the 1880s and the 1920s, receiving and distributing homes were established across rural and urban Canada, hundreds of them in total. Sponsoring sending agencies and names are still very well known. Bernardo was a big name, McPherson, Maria Rye, Fagans, and that is just to name a very few. Although the program largely halted with the coming of the Second World War, child migration to places like Australia continued, for instance, into the 1970s. And the last administration offices of Bernardo's were closed in Toronto, downtown Toronto, in the early 1960s. The program quickly expanded to include boys and girls of all ages across the United Kingdom. Though they are often described as orphans, only a minority truly were. That term simply helped make the process more acceptable, masking the reality that many poor families either believed that they were sending their children off to a better life, or the separation was only intended to be temporary. As the program developed, recruiters were paid to attract children for emigration overseas. Many in Britain did believe that the scheme offered a new beginning for vulnerable children. In reality, many in Canada were treated as no more than a cheap source of labor. Oversight was limited, and both from governments and the agencies responsible for placement. Children arriving in Canada, often through ports such as Montreal, Halifax, St. John, Victoria, and Quebec City, were received by distributing homes before being sent to families across the country. Once placed, they were largely left to fend for themselves. Now, not all home children experienced hardship. Some absolutely were adopted. I actually have a friend whose Uncle Billy she never knew was a home child. But as more and more has become known about the program, it is clear that many home children experienced difficult and exploitative conditions. They were often subject to the harsh realities of indentured labor, as well as physical, psychological, social, and sexual abuse. These experiences frequently shape their adult lives, leaving lasting stigma and shame. Many were reluctant to share their stories, even within their own families. Tracing them in the historical record is challenging as well. They were often either inconsistently recorded or completely absent, for instance, from Canadian census data. Although it is estimated that over 11% of Canadians today descend from a home child, many Canadians remain unaware of that potential connection in their family trees. In the Great War, more than 10,000 home children volunteered for the 600,000-strong Canadian Expeditionary Force, roughly 10% of the total children sent to Canada over the entire course of the program. This does not include the participation of home child women and girls on the home or battlefronts, or home child men and boys who were either too young or too old to serve. They enlisted and otherwise served for many reasons. Canada's political, cultural, and demographic ties to Britain remained strong during that period, and at the time, 60% of Canadians lived in rural communities where many home children were placed. Some sought escape from harsh placements. Others saw an opportunity for independence and wages, hoped to reconnect perhaps with family in Britain, or wished to serve what they considered to be their newly adopted country of Canada. This is a letter from 1915 written by an official at the Bernardo organization during what was described as the Winter of Anxiety, and it reflects those initial heavy losses experienced by the CEF and the BEF in the early Great War battles. The organization is appealing for continued support, and we're not above using the statistic that approximately 1,500 Bernardo boys had already enlisted by that point. Approximately 1,300 home children died in the Great War, a casualty rate that is comparable to our national averages. They're commemorated on memorials across Canada, including 229 listed on the Vimy Memorial to the Missing. Nearly 700 died in 1917 alone, and in the battles such as Vimy Ridge, Hill 70, and Passchendaele. 2 home children, Private Claude Nunny and Private Walter Rayfield, were awarded the Victoria Cross. Nunny came to Canada at age 12 and was awarded the VC posthumously while serving with the 38th Battalion in the final 100 days of the war. Rayfield was sent to Ontario at the age of 10, served with the 7th Battalion, and earned his Victoria Cross at the Second Battle of Arras in 1918, and he survived the war. In the Second World War, approximately 20,000 former home children served, including both veterans and children of earlier home child soldiers. Now, there are many questions about the potential relationship between childhood experience and wartime experience that my research will pose. How did home children's experiences compare to those of other Canadian soldiers? Did their early lives shape their motivations and experiences of war? What roles did home children, women, and girls play in the war? And what about the placements and experiences of home children of color? And how did questions of identity, British, Canadian, or somewhere in the middle, shape their sense of belonging? Amongst the questions that my dissertation poses, so who were these home children who served, and how can we see them? Can a connection be made between home children in Canada, who were a marginalized migrant population and who were undoubtedly shaped by geographic displacement, indentured labor, family fractures, and their motivations for and experiences of wartime service in this country? Whether a connection can be proven or not, my study will in any case explore the ways that home children participated in wartime, what their transition from child laborers to soldiers and war workers might reveal both the power wielded by the British and Canadian states over vulnerable children. My study is the first to link British home child history with Canada's military efforts and asks whether the transition from lives of servitude to military service might possibly represent a potential continuation of earlier patterns of life and discipline, and or a chance for new opportunities and belonging in a new country. One of the things that becomes clear about home child history is that it is a very large and unwieldy subject. It's difficult to really comprehend the scale and the depth of reach of the child migrant program when you try to look at it in its entirety. So like other historians of this subject, I can't really study everything at once. Instead, I will focus on a sort of representative slice of the history and set clear limits around what I think I can look at in detail. So over time, perhaps these focused looks will help build a sort of fuller and more balanced picture of home child history. So my study will focus largely on the participation of home child youth and adults in Canada's Great War, between 1914 and 1918. And one of the reasons for this is there is currently greater access to First World War personnel files than there is to files from the Second World War. So there's much more archival research to be found. As well, I will focus particularly on the Catholic rescue and emigration networks that were particularly influential in the north of England, so Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, and surrounding areas, and their connection to the most prominent Canadian Catholic receiving home of St. George's in Ottawa. Much of home child research focuses on the big name institutions. Everybody knows the name Bernardo's in one way or another. But the Catholic system is well deserving of academic attention. Rather than coordinating emigration through a large centralized organization, the Catholic Church operated through a network of diocesan and parish-based rescue agencies connected to a broader umbrella organizations such as the Catholic Emigration Society. Local rescue missions and diocesan charities, such as the Catholic Children's Aid Societies, usually served as a first point of entry for the children. Children were then transferred through the Catholic migration networks to receiving homes in Canada, and St. George's served as one of the key administrative Catholic centers. So the system relied heavily on existing parish networks and the local authority of the Catholic Church. Now, both Protestant and Catholic migration systems instilled ideas of commitment and hard work and discipline and sacrifice. Protestant and privately run schemes often framed this idea of rescue and belonging and achieving through hard work and labor. The Catholic system placed greater emphasis on religious identity, the importance of service and integration into parish life. The Catholic system was tightly organized with a direct and sustained link between these sending centers and St. George's in Ottawa. It is estimated that St. George's placed 8,000 to 10,000 children, many in southeastern Ontario and western Quebec. That allows me to look at how the Great War was experienced differently in those two provinces, and it certainly was. As well, my study will focus on home children who arrived in Canada between 1885 and 1918. And this allows me to study male and female home children of service or conscription age, including underage volunteers, through all the years of the Great War. So because of their exposure to displacement, derision, and disruption in their lives, I question whether some home children may have sought in the Canadian military or their war work many of the things that it was hoped by many in the program would provide. an escape from poverty or abuse, an income and a means to adulthood, a sense of belonging and adventure, and an opportunity to reclaim and serve some vestige of family and country. Importantly, those motivations to serve were also shared by many homegrown Canadian recruits to the war. So I hope to assess whether the war experiences of adult home children differed meaningfully from those of other Canadian soldiers who grew up being influenced by some of the same social, cultural, and imperial values of that period. So, from the archives. I've just returned, as I said, from 8 weeks of archival research in the United Kingdom, and I focused on collections in Liverpool, Manchester, and Birmingham, as well as at the National Archives in London. So at Kew, I primarily looked at Home Office and Treasury records to better understand the intentions behind the child migrant program at the point of inception at the level of the British state. Now, some of this does exist in secondary material, but I really wanted to read it for myself and see what I could glean from those documents. Alongside this, I conducted local archival research in those cities in the north of England, so Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, and examined the records of Catholic rescue and emigration societies operating on the ground there. So taken together, the research allows me to approach the program from two different directions. First, as context, sort of from above, where I look at government policy and planning, and then on the ground through day-to-day operations of the agencies responsible for sending children. I also uncovered really important traces of the children themselves in the archives, and they offer glimpses into how the system functioned in practice and how individual lives moved through it. Of course, great care has to be taken with archival research. Can't really exist on its own. It has to be brought into context. But it's very exciting to have some of the documentation that I have. So with that said, I'd like to share with you just a few of the documents that I was able to uncover over the course of my trip. So the perspective of the state, the Home Office and Treasury records. So keeping in mind that I probably have about 1,500 of those, and I certainly haven't started to do in-depth research on them, I'm just going to share with you a couple that were particularly interesting. So in 1884, the British government intended the setup of a network of care and sending agencies whose specific purpose was to prepare both boys and girls for emigration. Those children from orphanages, industrial schools, and poorhouses and workhouses would be the first children intended to be channeled through those institutions. There is evidence on the part of their motivation, that their motivation was to supply labor to the colonies, specifically with reference to Canada. So instead of the concept of children going to families, they were specifically categorized in these documents as employers. There's pretty clear and stated evidence that in those early days, at least by the Home Office, the scheme was intended to provide supply of trained labor to British colonies. Early emigrants were to be able-bodied and considered fit to work, no matter the age. There were squabbles, and actually the squabbles lasted through decades about who would cover the cost and also who would provide legal guardianship for the children. Though the state seemed hesitant to provide either one, they were happily anticipating that private agencies might take up the cause. But then, of course, things became even more tense as other people and other agencies became involved. So really the argument over who was paying for what and who would take responsibility for what, I saw right up until the 1920s. In its first incarnation, it was proposed that children also be placed in the US, as well as just British dominions. So that was really interesting to find. In this slide is an 1890 pamphlet from the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, and it supports very strongly and encourages the involvement of as many people as possible in the child migrant system. So the Catholic rescue agencies, the day books or day journals of Catholic rescue agencies provides insight into the kind of life that was provided for children on a day-to-day, week-to-week, and year-to-year basis. So this would have been still in the UK, and this would have been prior to any emigration of the children. We see that the life in these Catholic rescue agencies was grounded in religiosity, concerns and processes relating to the administration of sacraments, and certainly no child was allowed to emigrate overseas without the proper sacraments being administered according to their age. The number of times children attended Mass in a given day or week. The forms of entertainment provided for children were often based within the church community, but there was also a military nature about it as well. They would often be taken off to watch marching bands and military bands, or for particularly the boys, they would be involved in sea training, what was called sea training. So I have to dig a little bit more into what that exactly was. And then how they celebrated sort of high religious occasions like Easter or Christmas. There also was separate religious instruction as well as regular education. Also listed in these day books was the nature of the discipline and what children could be disciplined for. And the list, uncleanliness, untidiness, not taking care of one's possessions, being impudent to girls, losing one's possessions, fighting or brawling, not finishing meals, not completing homework, incorrect praying, causing a disturbance at Mass, talking back, and ending up with holes in one's clothes. And I had to think when I read it that that pretty much describes my 3 children. So in some way, children are always children. As well, we see the evidence of the kind of care that they received. Children were administered vaccinations en masse, as well as regular dental and health checkups. They would receive regular haircuts, regular baths, and new clothes when needed. Particularly interesting, and that would be in the picture of the document right in front, were the lists of children who were being sent to Canada, long lists of children. And I went through day books that covered many decades, and they were overwhelmingly sent to Canada. I mean, I already said there were 2/3 of them came, but in the day books that I looked at, there wasn't a single mention of children being sent anywhere else. So long lists of children being sent to Canada. And what was also interesting was there would also be, at certain times, long lists of children who were ill at the same time or sent to the hospital at the same time. So it also made me wonder, I wonder if there was some external stuff going on, something going around, or epidemics, etc. Problems in Canada. As early as the 1880s and certainly into the 1890s, there is a documentation that illustrates how government representatives were receiving indication, this is government representatives in the UK, that not all was well regarding the treatment of children in Canada. There was cruelty and exploitation outlined in letters between Canadian inspectors, the British government, letters from family members hearing of issues with their children, and in a couple of cases, personal letters from the children themselves. Again, there was nothing mentioned about that happening in other countries. That's not to say that it didn't. I may not have had time yet to really go through that material, but this did seem to be a specific problem in certain years regarding sending children to Canada. And at one point, it was proposed by the UK government in the interwar years, so the years between the First and Second World War, that British agencies stopped sending anyone under the age of 16 to Canada. A certain kind of boy. From the beginning, there was such language used in correspondence between British government and colonial representatives with regard to what they would refer to as a certain kind of boy that was considered the ideal to be sent to the colonies. And this obviously would make sense if the focus was on supplying labor. There was an interesting government directive I discovered that chastised officials in charge of health, and that they had grown lax in ensuring that the children were healthy and given health exams before they went overseas, with a concern that particularly the boys were not receiving physicals that ensured that they were strong and healthy. Now, as a historian, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I take that as its word, but the date on that directive was really interesting in that it was in the spring of 1914. And so it leads me to wonder whether they were thinking about having to provide the colonies with soldiers in the near future. But there's more to be discovered there. Another interesting official conversation who accused the government of doing just this. So this was wonderful to discover, because one of the blank spots in home child history when you're trying to just do research on this end in Canada is we never know where they were placed exactly. It was really hard. You had to go digging through census records to see if maybe they were listed, and then find that address, find that placement family. But there are so many of these sheets that just list exactly where these children were placed, the names of the family, the addresses. So that was actually a wonderful find. Some of you know who that handsome guy is. So, case studies. Case studies are detailed examinations of individual people or experiences that allow historians to look closely at how larger systems work in real life. And they are an important part of my project. I use them to follow home children across their journeys from emigration and placement to wartime service, showing how broader patterns of migration, labor, and military participation were experienced on the ground. For many impoverished families in late 19th and early 20th century Britain, state welfare intervention frequently resulted in the separation of children from their parents. George Beardshaw is one such child. At approximately 3 years old, his mother surrendered him from the workhouse in which they'd been living since his birth to a Bernardo's orphanage in Kent. In a 2023 oral history interview that I conducted with George, he recalled little from those early years, but gradually came to believe that his parents were dead, and no one told him otherwise. Enticed by promises of excitement and adventure made by a Bernardo's recruitment representative, George followed his 2 older brothers to Canada as part of the British migrant program. Beardshaw was placed at the age of 15 with a Lindsay, Ontario farming family and discovered that he was expected to fulfill a 5-year contract of labor he had neither seen nor signed. He spent the next several years as an indentured farmhand and repeatedly ran away from mistreatment and abuse. At the age of 18, Beardshaw went to Toronto and enlisted in the Canadian Army. He later learned that his family was alive and that he had a mother and a grandmother and a sister he never knew about. And so while overseas, traveled to meet what he described to me as a bunch of strangers. This encounter with fragmented family identity speaks to the kind of influence wielded by state authorities on the lives of children in both Britain and Canada. Though Beardshaw's life is singular in personal detail, it reflects the broader experience of those placed in the British child migrant program, where these fractured personal identities were a common consequence of being displaced and of growing up in institutional care. George landed on Juno Beach in the month after D-Day. He fought through France and the Netherlands, and in the final months of the war was captured by the Germans and remained a POW until war's end. After the war, George was invited to Buckingham Palace to be thanked for his service in the Second World War by King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. He accepted their gratitude, but he told me with mixed feelings. After all, he said, what had Britain ever really done for me? Beardshaw was adamant that his home child experiences indeed prepared him in many ways for life as a soldier. He told me he was always working and always working hard. If nothing else, both systems relied on authority, structure, and discipline, and funneled British and Canadian youth into imperial or national service. Though George's case study sits outside the parameters of my study in many ways, he was a Second World War soldier. He didn't come through the Catholic system or St. George's. He is what might be termed a sensational single case. The fact that he's still with us and still sharing his experiences of both the Home Child program and the World War is very special. He's the last living home child that we have. He's the last living member of the Queen's Own Rifles, World War II Queen's Own Rifles, and one of our few Canadian World War II veterans. So he is indeed very special. And his story offers a rare first-hand perspective that helps bring the broader history to life, while also reminding us that we do have to be cautious about how truly representative any single experience can be. But oral history interviews, such as mine with George, can really lend intimacy and immediacy to the historical record, and it preserves insight and details of his experience that we can't find in any other way. And it allows those who lived through historical events to literally speak to and through the past. And I'm very happy that I can access George's experiences as part of my study. So this young boy is Thomas Higgins. He was born in Stockton-on-Tees, which is the North Yorkshire area of England, in June of 1896. And here he is with his mother and father. By 1908, Thomas was living with his uncle, but remained legally under the guardianship of the Stockton Poor Law Union. As such, it was the union, rather than his uncle, that authorized and facilitated his transfer into the care of Father Barry's Homes, which fed Catholic immigration in Britain, from which he was subsequently selected for emigration to Canada. On the application to emigrate, it was stated that Thomas's father had died and his mother could not be found. He sailed to Canada in August of 1909 and was received at St. George's Receiving Home in Ottawa. From that point, Thomas's life becomes ever more difficult. Over the course of the next 3 years, Thomas was placed with no fewer than 5 Canadian families, in between periods of running away. He was first placed in Quebec and subsequently into households in Dundee, Carleton, and Ottawa. Inspectors' reports state that he had not adapted well to any of his placements and was sometimes missing for months at a time before they would find him and reassign him to another home. In 1912, when he was 15, he disappeared and was not found until 2 years later in 1914. He said he'd been living as best he could, doing odd jobs. After that, the program lost touch with him again, and he only reappeared to me when I found him in the Great War Service files. He attested at Kingston on November 10th, 1914, and he survived pretty much the entire length of the Great War as a private in the 21st Battalion Canadian Infantry. He was shot in 1916, and after a series of injuries and infections, spent time in a war hospital in Epsom, England, before he was discharged as being unfit for further duty. More details on Thomas's life will appear, I hope, when I begin my research on this side of the Atlantic, my Canadian research, and I can look for traces of him in the records for St. George's. So the truly poignant aspect of Thomas's life is that not long after he arrived in Canada, he began to receive letters from his mother, who had remarried and was living in Edinburgh. She tells Thomas that he has a new father and that they were working hard to get him back home. St. George's acted as a mediator between mother and son, forwarding letters back and forth between them. A 1910 letter from his mother states that she is working hard to get him back from Canada, as she was then capable of caring and providing for him. She says, "My dear son, I received your letter all right. I'm going to keep trying to get you home. They are not keeping you there for your own benefit, but for the money they get sending the likes of you out there. I always wait for such a long time to get a few lines from you. A man named Mr. Castles is your new father, and he is working hard to get you home too. I want my little Tom back so that I can look after you. Hoping to hear from you soon. Goodbye and God bless my darling little son." When his birthday drew near that year, she tells him of a wonderful watch that she has for him. She's unsure whether to keep it for his homecoming or whether she should send it to him. She tells him about his family life in Edinburgh. A letter late in 1910 tells him that she has been told by both the Stockton Union and Catholic authorities that she must pay them back for all the money that they spent on Thomas if she wants him to return, and that she must also pay for his journey home. In the letter after that, she writes, "They tell me that if I want you home, I shall have to pay for what it costs them to send you away, and also what it costs to bring you home. I want to try to pay that, but I cannot afford all that she wants." And she ends that letter with the fact that she hopes that he knows how loved and wanted he is. So accompanying these letters is correspondence, very interesting correspondence, between the sending institution in the UK and representatives from St. George's, who decided that the boy should receive no more letters from his mother, because when he does, he becomes despondent and stops working. And it's not long after that, after the final letter from his mother, that Thomas begins to run away from his placements. And a final directive to Thomas's mother is recorded, and I have it here, in May of 1911, when the organization requests that she stop writing to Thomas altogether. And they say, "We have received back again from Canada the letters which you have sent to your son. We have had a distinct request made to us that no letters from England should be sent on to him, as the boy, after receiving such letters, is wont to become, the grammar is off, is wont to become loose interest in his work, and he becomes unstable and unsatisfactory. I can quite understand your desire to correspond at times with your son, but when you know that this has taken place and that it might have a very serious effect upon the lad's future, I must ask that you not trouble him for the foreseeable future." So, for a historian, and with regard to my study, this episode of Thomas Higgins offers a revealing window into the authority and also the lived experiences and consequences of the child migrant program. Thomas Higgins' experience shows how institutional power could override both family and parental claims, as the Stockton Poor Law Union exercised legal guardianship despite his residence with his uncle, enabled his transfer to Father Barry's homes, and then the eventual emigration through Catholic networks to St. George's. So this illustrates how the system operated, in which local welfare authorities, religious agencies, and transatlantic organizations collectively shaped the experience of a home child and also determined their fate. And at the same time, Thomas's repeated placement failures, periods of disappearance, and eventual drift into period labor so that he could literally survive, highlights the instability and the vulnerability embedded into the program. Perhaps most striking is the correspondence with his mother, which exposes both the emotional toil of separation and the deliberate intervention of authorities in family relationships. The decision to withhold letters and ultimately sever contact underscores how institutions prioritized discipline, labor, and adjustment over family reunification. Finally, his later enlistment prompts further questions. In 1914, it was literally only a matter of a month between when his mother was asked to stop sending letters and when Thomas ran off to join the Canadian Army. So that prompts so many questions. Was he running? Was he seeking something? What happened to his contract as an indentured laborer, which was signed on behalf of most home children and only expired upon the age of majority? George shared in our oral history interview that when he ran away and when he went to enlist in the army, Bernardo's followed him and said, you have a contract with us. So questions around that are also important. Now, there's no indication that this happened to Thomas in that earlier war, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Obviously, much more digging has to be done into these files. So between my home office and treasury records, and also all the personal files that I now have, I have about 4,000 documents that I get to spend the next year digging into. So my work is certainly cut out for me. So once again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present and to talk about my upcoming research. You've been a wonderful audience, and I thank you very much.
Your voice made it really well. Do we have any questions?
Yes.
Well, I was born in Scotland. I'm not from a home child background at all. In Canada when I was 10.
Yes.
I'm interested in two aspects of this. I'm doing family history, and about the time of, I can't remember precisely, schooling became compulsory in the UK, and I can't remember what date that was. It was about that time, 1880s, 1870s.
Yeah.
How did that affect the program? So that's just one question. The second one is totally unrelated, but and it may be beyond the purview of your research.
Mm-hmm.
But during the Second World War,
Yes.
there was a program for sending children from cities like London and Birmingham and Manchester into the countryside.
Yes.
But with the consent, I think it was, with of their families.
Right.
And many, in fact, from that program were sent to Canada as well.
Yes.
And I have a good friend who's since passed away, but he came to Canada first after during the Second World War, and his experience was so positive, fortunately, that after he'd gone back to Britain, he emigrated to Canada. He wanted to get back to the life that he'd experienced here. Were there any parallels between that sort of wartime? The motive was to allow them to escape from the bombing of the cities like London and Manchester and Liverpool.
Right. So different motive altogether, and also different legally, because with the home child program, once a child, that first point of contact in the rescue agency, and once they're in that program, it's very difficult to get them out again. And at some point in time, as we see just in these examples, and there are certainly many more, there's the question of legal guardianship. And although I see lots of argument about how and to whom that should go, it definitely did not favor the parents. So also in those files, I see many, many cases of families trying very hard to get their children back when they realized that either they could or wanted their children back, and it is a tough fight. So there's that legal aspect as well. I guess there could be some parallels drawn somewhat in that, at least on the surface of it, the British Home Child Program was supposed to be for the child's own good. And then for the Second World War, we're trying to get children out of the way to safety. So there could be similar parallels in that kind of way, but I don't think they really go too deep. And actually, within the scope of this project, I haven't really connected it to, there actually are many other sort of emigration projects that happened over time. But yeah, I think there's an interesting difference there. You asked about education. Actually, that is one of my questions. Certainly when I was looking at the logbooks and the daybooks of these rescue agencies, so when children were there and under their care, before they emigrated to Canada, those children attended classes, they were educated. And as I say, in the Catholic system, they also received Catholic instruction as well. But they absolutely were educated on a daily basis. So, yeah. Sorry, Judy, did you want to follow up with something?
Sending the children, they were told that they would go on in school.
Right.
And through George, that didn't happen, and lots of the home children that lived up where he was, it never happened either. They never went on to school ever again.
Right. So and the one thing that you also learn when you begin to study this topic is there's so much variation. So what I might be seeing for Catholic children who come through Catholic Immigration and Rescue, may not be the same across other agencies. And also, before I continue, I was going to make a really exciting announcement. I completely forgot. But George Beardshaw has been honored by Wilfrid Laurier University, and on June the 9th, he will be receiving an honorary doctorate at the convocation on that day. So it's great news, and so that should be a really happy day for George. Oh my gosh, I don't know who first. Sorry,
I have just in the last 2 years, discovered the British home children. My husband was born 2 weeks after his father was killed in service, and one of our daughters wanted to find out more about her grandfather and discovered he was a British home child. I'm wondering why so little is known, why it's not part of curriculum, why Canada has never apologized. I tried contacting the War Museum in Ottawa. They gave me no information. Have you discovered why Canada is so reluctant to make home children visible?
I'll tell you an interesting story. So it's not just Canada. I think this is a very little known part of history across the board. I was speaking at a Remembrance Day luncheon a few years ago, and I just happened that year, because I kind of choose a different topic every year, I just happened that year to be talking about my early home child research and the home child program. And because I was speaking in the Navy, I spoke about home children who ended up in the Canadian Navy. But in the audience was the British Consul General. And I didn't know he was there. And here I had been speaking about some very political things. And I thought, oh my gosh, I hope I didn't insult one of these dignitaries in the audience. And he never came up to me afterwards, and I thought, oh, should I go up to him? What should I say? But I didn't. So 2 weeks later, I got an email from him saying that he was so embarrassed that he had no idea what the home child program was. And he's British. He's the British Consul General. Had no idea what the program was or the history. Now, in the UK, home children have been recognized far more than in some of the former dominions, Canada, Australia, etc. At one point in time, they encouraged former home children to come forward, and they were paid reparations. There was an official apology from Gordon Brown, as well as Australia has issued a formal apology. Canada has not. And also, yes, it is little known history in Canada. And so I think home child advocacy works to try to do what they can to correct that. It's received relatively little academic attention at this level. So there's not much out there for me to refer to, but the good news is that in the last 2 years alone, there have been 3 new books on home children, one from a Canadian author and then 2 from British authors. So it's gradually, I think, maybe gaining attention. It's certainly worthy of attention. So, yes.
My father's a Dr. Bernardo.
Yes.
And he came over in 1930. He did go back. He was in the Air Force and for the Second World War. I guess in listening to your talk, I have just a couple of comments, because I've got history degree, and I've also read a lot about the juvenile immigration movement and Dr. Bernardo's and all that kind of stuff. And my concern is you've focused on all the negatives that have happened in that program, whereas there was a lot of people who came over and their life turned out quite well, my dad included. We actually would visit the farm he was placed on. And the other thing is, I'd caution you, is, and maybe I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're using today's standards to judge yesterday's beliefs. And because the beliefs did change as things went along. There was arguments about, what they should be doing, whether they should be doing this. Oversight, there was no oversight really. There was very minimal. They'd use ministers, priests, and even that didn't work. So a lot of children, were abused, used as labor. But also the belief was in sending them over here, they were teaching them trades, and they thought they were going to give them a good life. And the other thing was, the belief back then was, when my dad was put in at the age of 8, they changed the age to send kids over to 14. But the belief back then was you cut off the relationship between the parents and the child, because it was thought that was better for them. But you've brought up, these ideas that, it's terrible that they did that. And yeah, it is. But I just think you're focusing on purely the negatives.
Well,
And my
actually,
concern is that you're not painting
Right.
the whole picture. And I know you're just starting,
yes,
and
so
I
I'll say,
thank you for studying this.
so I'll say a couple of things about that. I've actually not, I don't think, rendered any judgment. What I have done is try to explain what I was able to take from just these few pieces of documentation. And as I said, I've got like 4,000 to look through. So it's arbitrary what has come out of what I've tried to share with you today. No, absolutely. And as I said, I too have a friend whose Uncle Billy was a home child, and he was adopted by their family. And certainly one of my questions, I think, is to look at whether one of those connections between home child sort of experience was their training, and perhaps they could then have taken that into war service or war work. But I really have tried very hard not to judge, and just to present some of the documentation that I found, and let it sort of speak for itself at the moment. When I finish my research and I get writing,
That's why I'm commenting.
absolutely.
One story my dad had was,
Yeah.
he said, well, the reason I chose Canada was in case I changed my mind, I could swim back. I don't think you had a choice.
Absolutely. And I think one of the points I made near the end is there's so much variation of experience, right? Some children were very closely watched and monitored, others not at all. Certainly they came to realize that there was a woeful lack of oversight, and in some cases tried to correct it, in some cases not. So a variation on motivations, a variation on how policies were implemented, variation on what was coming down from sort of both UK and Canadian states in terms of policy, etc. So much variation.
Even when there was oversight, people would go and visit. They weren't trained how to do that because in many cases they just interviewed the farmer. They didn't interview the child at all. And so.
Great, thank you for your comment. Yes, and then Ali, I'll get to you.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Did any and how many children make it back to the United Kingdom?
That's an excellent question. And it's a question that I've long had. And somehow, I would love to sort of dig into that and see if I can come up with rough numbers. Because at this point, I don't know, but I also have that question. I wonder how many children actually went back and tried to build lives there. I do know that, I talked about the motivations for enlistment, particularly looking at the Great War. And obviously, in certain parts of this country, there was an ideological connection between Canada and Britain at that time. And so some home children chose, when they went to enlist, to go back and fight for British forces. So didn't choose to enlist for the Canadians. They chose to go back home and fight in Britain. So yeah, there absolutely was still connection, I think.
Thank you.
So interesting. Sorry, I'm just going to get to Ali, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you for a great talk, Kelly. I
Thanks,
was just
Sally.
curious, you mentioned George, Bernardo's kind of came after him when he was enlisting. Do you know if he did face any consequences, or was there any
No,
impact
he-
to his enlistment?
I know
He
he
never
didn't.
did
No.
run away.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's, he didn't really. He didn't really. So, yeah, I guess it changed. Because I remember him telling me Bernardo's came after me. Remember?
When he enlisted?
Yeah, when he enlisted, he told me that was,
Now, he got letters from them, and they
He got-
always kept contact with him through the whole military.
right, so.
How old was it at that
Eight,
time?
he was
He was just going on, he was just over 18.
18.
So why would they contact him? after
Well, you
18?
know, in some cases, and this is also a variation,
Time was not up.
yeah, it depends. It depended on how long your contract lasted for. And again, so much variation at that time. In some places, age of majority was 18, and some 21. So it really depended on your contract and what was stipulated in the contract that was signed on your behalf.
Who did the actual signing for this?
It would have been representatives from the sending agencies, from the rescue/sending agencies. Those contracts would have been signed.
Thank you.
I think, and I think in some cases, if families were made to believe that they were doing the best for their child, sometimes families would sign them. Not really understanding, I think, but I don't know. It's hard to, I don't want to put anything out there, any judgments out there. But certainly, there is knowledge of families signing those contracts. Yes.
I met one of these boys years ago as a senior in an Alzheimer's Day program, and he was sent from Birmingham. He was a orphan, and he just talked about how kind of abusive they were out in the farm, of the long hours, just like a moneymaker. And then eventually he got old enough to join the army. I think he had flat feet, but he got a job as a motorcycle dispatcher. And he says those were the glory days for him. And then he ended up staying in Canada because he loved Canada.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yes.
I have a quick question. So, was the home child program specifically focused on England, or have you come across within your research any cases of children that came from Wales, Scotland, or even Ireland?
Yeah, so Wales, I'll have to do some looking into Wales. I was asked about Wales before because I don't find a lot about Wales, but definitely Scotland, out of Glasgow. You look for industrial cities. Definitely Dublin, out of Ireland. So it wasn't just in England proper. And there are also records of home children coming from the continent as well. I found 2 little girls who were from Paris.
Yeah, my great aunts both came, they were sent as home children from France.
From France. So yeah, I've seen notifications of that and them being absorbed into the program. So definitely not just from England.
England,
Thank you very much.
the Isle of Man, and Scotland.
Yeah, and Scotland.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't hear much about Wales, and I've not seen anything about Wales. But I haven't
George's brothers-
specifically looked either.
George's brothers, they had, I guess they're like foster families.
Oh,
They went out from Bernardo's and stayed with them.
Oh,
and
I see.
They were in the Isle of Man and in Wales for short periods of time, I don't know how long.
yeah. I mean, the program actually was very far-reaching, and also where they sent children was very far-reaching. And so, again, you can go back to that variation of experience and rules and guidelines and the degree to which children could be overseen. Just so many different experiences. Right? So, yes.
Just a final point of interest, perhaps. The age majority, of course, in the armed forces at that time, you had boy sailors and boy soldiers. The famous boy sailor was Jack Cornwall, who won the Victoria Cross in the battle in the in the North Sea. And I can't remember what a boy sailor was. He was about 10 or 11 years old. It was quite extraordinary how low the age of majority was for that.
Well, you have to understand, some ran away to enlist, lied about their age, and as the war went on and they needed more and more troops, of course, They became very lax about checking, officially checking. So, yeah, absolutely. So there was a population, absolutely, of underage soldiers in the British and colonial armies. Tim Cook actually wrote a great article on that. It's called He Was Determined to Go, and it's well worth a read, where he tries to, you know, how do we see underage soldiers and what their experience might have been in the Great War. He's looking specifically at Canadian soldiers. It's a great article. I highly recommend it.
Well, so Kelly took our family to outside here. It's the statue for Mr. McRae, and in that same cemetery,
Yes.
we were there. There were busloads of UK children because one of the
Yes, his name is Valentine Strudwick, and he's actually one of the most visited soldiers on the Western Front because of his age. I believe he was 15. But in that time, they've identified a 13-year-old in the British Armed Forces for the Great War as well. So, yeah, it absolutely did exist. Yes?
Not to defend the Catholic Church, I am Catholic, and not to defend the farmers, but there were courthouses back then as well that exploited.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I'm gonna get the last I was just wondering if Thomas Higgins, did he ever get to see his mom when he was back in England?
Yeah, so I have to continue on Thomas, because what was interesting about Thomas was that when he first signed up, they ask you to fill out a will, of course, and who is your beneficiary. And he named a woman in Ottawa. I have to figure out who she was. Maybe he was boarding with her, I don't know. But by 1918, when he was getting out of the hospital, and the army was asking him, near the end of 1918, where he wanted his money sent while he was in hospital, he named his mother. So they somehow found each other. So whether he went back, I'm not sure. I have to do some digging into that. So.
Thank you. So you've got 4,000 pages of.
I do. I have a lot of work to do.
Hopefully you brought a couple bottles of scotch back so you can keep going with that. Thank you again for the wonderful talk. Really delightful. I just want to let everyone know that we will be continuing the lectures in September, and we'll be working on getting our lectures from them. And I wanted to let people know about the Laurier Center for the Study of Canada is having their military symposium on May 8th and 9th. And it is fantastic.
Yes.
But it's a fantastic thing. It's open to the public. It's a great way to spend a couple days if you're into military history. And I'm looking forward to that.
Yes.
From Laurier again.
From the Laurier Center.
So thanks so much.